Sometimes you look around and you think, why are we so divided in this world? A lot of people have the same notions and the same assumptions that we're all human, are we not? I mean, I know that we have different cultures and different beliefs, different practices, different religions, but we're all floating on this little rock that's hurtling through interstellar space. Why don't we just come together? Well, that question has a lot of answers, but I believe I've figured it out. And it's not any one thing that does it. The quickest assumption that some will make is that it's religion, why we're so divided. And to a large extent, that is true. But I don't think that's the source, the original reason. I think human beings started playing this game at a certain point, and the game has been going on ever since. And that game is, oh no, black might win, which in turn starts another game called but white must win. And that's created a versus system. And it's everywhere around us. It's everywhere in our society. Some of the most prime examples are Republicans versus Democrats, atheists versus Christians, Christians versus anyone not Christian. You have good versus evil. You have right versus wrong. You have light versus dark. And there's something that all of that has in common, and that's the verses. Because you seem to think that everything must be opposites. There is just so much opposition in this world. And I don't know if it's a human trait, or if it's a social trait, or if it's an economic trait, or if it's an ethnic trait. But it seems to exist everywhere in the world. And it doesn't matter what you put into slot A and slot B, as long as that versus is in between those two words, we will always have opposition. We will always have adversity. No, I think I figured it out. And it boils down to you, the individual. Except that the individual everywhere in the world is exactly the same. You see, we all have this thing called ego. And in modern times, within the recent 20 or 30 years, the word ego has kind of transformed. It doesn't necessarily mean how I mean it. When you go up to a coffee shop or a bar and you start playing music and you're really good, and everybody knows that you're really good, and then you let them know that you're really good, oftentimes people will say, man, what an ego that guy has on him. Ego in that sense means cockiness, arrogance. That's not what ego means. You see, your ego is this little part of your brain that seems to think that it's the whole being. You know, when somebody asks you the question, who are you? You oftentimes come up with a name. Oh, my name is Joe Dokes. My name is Vincent Kennard. But that's not who we are. And then a lot of people will answer with a job title. Oh, I'm a doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a nurse. Again, that's not who you are. Who are you, really? And when people ask you that question, what they're really asking is, what do you identify your ego as? You see, we tend to answer that question based off of our ego, because our ego is what we think of ourselves and what others think of us. And the problem with that is that it is just 1% of the entire being that is you. And I've had many conversations with people about saying that you don't know who you are. And of course, I've gotten all sorts of responses. Like, of course I do. I know exactly who I am. I know what I want in life. I know what, my experiences that defined me and all this and all that. And it's not untrue. That is a part of the being that is you, but that's not who you are. Those are things that have happened to you. Those experiences have helped shape how you see the world, but those are not who you are. You see, we can't really answer that question because we don't truly know who we are, and that's based off of how our symmetrical brains work. That, in conjunction with our limited consciousness, how we only notice the figure and ignore the background. We only pay the attention to things that matter to us, and we ignore everything else. I would say it's not so much ignorance, it's ignorance. You ignore things because they're constants, they're safe. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It's been doing that since you were born, so you don't pay attention to it. You only pay attention to when it goes from night to dark, but even that's a constant because we've had the assumption that it's going to continue to happen. But no, truly, who are you? What are you? What do you define as you? What type of question is that, really? Does it have an answer? Well, yes and no. You see, who I am is limited to how I was raised and the experiences I had when I was raised and who taught those experiences to me. From the time that you were born, people are eager to tell you who you are. Your parents try to project their ego onto you. And that's called parenting. They try to teach you the difference between right and wrong. But see, that right and wrong is only their opinion. It's not actually what is right and wrong. There is no such thing as absolute right and absolute wrong. Now, most of us, if not all of us, but most of us can agree that things such as pedophilia is wrong. But to that extent, and I'm only using that because it's an extreme thing that most people will disagree with, except for the pedophiles. They will disagree with you. They'll disagree with you because they do it. If they knew it was absolutely wrong, well, they would try to, hide it better or not do it at all. But there isn't an absolute truth. There isn't an absolute right and an absolute wrong. Because that is based off of our prejudices. That is based off of our opinions. That is based off of people that we have been surrounded ourselves by and our influences. And that's just your perspective. It's perception. When you perceive something, in other words, you're saying, this is how I see this. But we're not all the same. None of us are, because we would have to have the exact same experiences, raised by the exact same parents in the exact same environment at the exact same time, with the exact same amount of technology available, programming, music, what have you. And it's just not the case. And so that's the start of why we're all so divided, because we can't see the world the same way. There are a lot of us that can hold the same opinions. Take, for example, churches. A congregation will go to church every Sunday, and sometimes every Wednesday, and churches are usually led by a pastor or a teacher or a preacher or a cardinal or what have you. And everybody at that church will continuously go every Sunday because they like how that person preaches. Now, I have experience with this. There was a time when I was a part of a church, and when I had started going there was a brand new pastor, and he was a young pastor, considering he was only about 33 years old, 32 years old. But at that time, that was young, especially for a Southern Baptist church. And he was an immensely popular preacher. He had vibrance and he had energy. And people liked what he had to say. They liked his interpretation of the Bible. And see, that's all a pastor does, is they preach to you out of the Bible based on their interpretation of the Bible, their viewpoint, their perspective, their idea what the truth is. And people buy into the idea of their perspective. They may not agree with every single little thing, but they have to make the assumption that, okay, this guy went to Bible college. This guy has been studying the Bible for X amount of years. Maybe he knows something I don't. I kind of like the way he put that. Maybe I'll rethink my idea. And in a lot of ways, churches is a great place to be a follower. Because is that not what you're taught in church, to be a follower of Christ? Does God not even call you sheep? You know, that's actually not a good thing when the Lord says that we are his sheep. That means he's saying we're stupid and that we're dull and that we follow the leader. That's what he's saying. And that he must tend into his flock, because sheep, if one sheep starts walking off of a cliff, the other sheep will go right behind it, just keep going off. That's just, not a good thing. So, is that the reason why we're divided? Just because we have different perspectives and we see things differently? Well, not necessarily. I mean, we can have different perspectives, but we can see bigger things and have belief in that bigger thing. Like, for an example, we can have belief in a song. If someone comes out with a very popular song that has very good meaning and it moves people, even though they may have different interpretations of that song, the general feel of that song is that it's a good song. It's an inspiring song. So, just because we have different perspectives, it doesn't mean that we can't have the same goals and that we can't achieve those same goals. World War II was full of that. A lot of people today, and it's saddened me because my own nephew couldn't tell me where the Middle East was and doesn't know anything about World War II. Not the first thing. But he could tell you who Kim Kardashian is, and he could tell you, the newest Jordans that are coming out. And that's nothing more than as the generations change, the priorities change based off of the environment, and I mean not just the regular environment, the political environment, the economic environment. Who were the major players on the field at that time? But World War II was full of different ideals and different perspectives and different goals. Yet, it broke down essentially into two sides, the Axis and the Allies. And we had issues within the Allies. We had issues within the Axis. Stalin hated fascism. He was a communist. He wanted to eradicate fascism, but he saw the unwillingness of Britain and France, and even to an extent America, not willing to step in and say, hey, what are we going to do about Hitler? So he decided to join Hitler at first. But it's not our perspectives that divide us. But it does have something to do with that versus. Only it can be broken down to a simple idea of self versus other. And that's what divides us. Self versus other. Because you are always going to pit yourself against other, because that's all you have is self versus other, because you can't experience it any other way. The world, in the way that you see it, is utterly unique to you. There is no one else inside of your internal being, inside of your mind. Everyone is in your external world. You are the only one in your internal world. Therefore, there can only be one self and many others. And so everything that we have going on in this world that is adversity and opposition is self versus other. Because then you take those two words out and replace them with something else, and it still goes down to self versus other. If you take Republicans versus Democrat, let's say that you're a Republican. I'm going to pick Republican because I used to be a hardcore Republican, and I used to believe that Democrats were absolutely bonkers. But it boiled down to the influences that I had from my father and from my mother and from my peers and the teachers and the place that I lived in the United States of America at the time was very heavily Republican influenced. But it really boiled down to was, because of all that, in my own mind, myself, the self, believed that Republicans, or the ideals of the Republicans, right? And everyone else was other. And so it is the Democrats were others, and even the Republicans were others. But because I was a Republican, I identified myself with my party. Good versus evil, light versus dark. It all comes down to self versus other. Because you can't see the world any other way. Your brain, so intricately designed as it is, won't allow you to see it that way. Ego won't allow you to see it any other way. Not as long as you're asleep. When you wake up, that changes slightly. And so we are so divided because of that. But here's the thing. There is no versus. There never was. Because you cannot have self without other to compare it to. Does that make sense? Things are not opposed. When you think of the yin and the yang, the black and the white. Like I said earlier, oh no, black might win, but white must win. We tend to think of this whole good versus evil, and a lot of that stems from the Christian theology that is heavily influenced in our Western cultures. It's this pitting this one thing against this other, and this eternal struggle for your soul and for this and for that. And it's just not the case. There isn't a versus, because anything that you can fit into that mold, Republicans and Democrats, the same concept. If you didn't have the party of Democrats and what they believe with, you wouldn't know what a Republican was. And if you didn't have Republicans believing what they believed, you wouldn't know what a Democrat was. But they are two sides of the same coin, and you'll hear that one a lot, about how Republicans and Democrats are two sides of the evil coin. They're all corrupt, and they're all this and they're all that. But it goes to anything that you can think of. You wouldn't know what light was unless you had dark to compare it to. You wouldn't know what happiness was unless you had suffering. You wouldn't know what love is unless you had hate. Even though I don't believe that hate is the opposite of love in that scenario. I believe if we're going to do the opposite scenario, that indifference is the opposite of love. But they're not opposed. They're on two opposite ends of the same spectrum. They go together. Everything in this universe goes together. It is a go-togetherness. It's really easy to understand that, but very hard to put it into practice because of our ego. We tend to think that this small part of us, the part that sees, the part that thinks, when you talk to yourself inside of your head, that's called thinking. And I had said earlier that you are influenced by the people that are around you. You are taught what to believe. And as you get older, that belief system can change depending on who you hang out with and the experiences that you have gone through and the influences that you have. But you don't really truly know who you are. Not really. Because the ego is a very small part of you, very small part of you. When you sit down on the ground and it's cold, does your body feel cold? Or do you feel cold? Where does it start and where does it end? If your hand is cut, are you hurt or is your body hurt? And it sends all of these electrical receivers to your brain. Which one is right? You see, we take the ego, the idea of self. You know, who are you? Who am I? And we blanket that over everything. But it's not who you are. Your ego doesn't exist. It's a fabrication. It's an illusion. Only in the Western world, we can't accept that. We can't understand that because we're seeing it from the perspective of the ego. And it's the same thing as when somebody announces to the world that they're going to get rid of the devil. For an example, you want to quit smoking. So you announce to the world, I'm going to quit smoking. Well, then all of a sudden you start seeing all of these signs for smoking. You start becoming around people that are smokers, and it's hard to do because you're serving notice on yourself. And when you serve notice on yourself, you just make it harder for yourself because you're telling your ego, I'm going to get rid of something that you enjoy. And your ego, because it enjoys it, is going to be like, okay, we'll see how that goes. So then the other way to do it is not to serve notice, is to just quietly make the decision that day to quit smoking. And you're going to run into the same problem because how do you announce something without announcing it, even though you're announcing it? Because the devil's still going to find out. Who do you think the devil really is? You are your own worst enemy. You sabotage yourself more than anyone else does. I sabotage myself more than anyone else. But what is I? What is you? What is that? Even further than the self versus other, I'll go so far as to say that the I center, the ego, is the reason why we are so divided. Because you can take a stand on something, but that stand, that belief, is not something that you were born with. You're not born with the innate belief that Republicans are right and Democrats are wrong, or that Democrats are right and Republicans are right. You were learned. You were taught that by your influences. So when you take a stand for something, your ego believes in it. But that ego has also been shaped its entire life by everything around it. It doesn't know what it is. It just knows what it's been taught. And so you can never truly come together with the world unless you understand what you really are and who you really are. And when someone becomes awakened, when enlightenment happens, they discover who they really are. But the answer would surprise you. It's a pretty contrived answer. And it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it, again, I said there's no absolute truth, because no one truly ever knows. But we're divided because we don't know who we are. Not really. Because we don't know who we are, how could we ever know who someone else is? But you see, there's no point into being divided and coming together. We will always be divided. Because there will always be self and there will always be other. But they're not opposed. They are two parts on opposite ends, yes, but they're part of a whole. Good and evil are on the same spectrum. Now, good is not like evil, obviously, but they're not enemies. They're not going against each other. They're not clashing against each other. You wouldn't know what good is without bad. They have to be together. They have to go together. Because you would not know what good is unless you had evil to compare it to. You wouldn't know what good was. I'll give you a very simple explanation, or I should say not an explanation, but an example. Say you have in the whole of the universe just one star, nothing else around it, and you were in a spaceship. Now, there is no way to tell whether or not that star was moving or standing still, because you have nothing else to compare it to. Motion can only be described as motion as being compared to something that is relatively still. But if you had just one star, you wouldn't know whether it's moving or standing still. Now, say you had two stars, and one looks like it's either moving away and one looks like it's standing still. And again, that's kind of difficult, but depending on your perspective and where you're looking at, one can go further away or one can go the other way. One could be standing still, one could be moving away. It's a little bit more easier to determine which one is moving. But again, it becomes a perspective issue. Now, let's say you have three stars, and you have two stars that are kind of clumped together, and one of them starts going away, or the other two start going. Now, which one is it? Is it, the two stars like, hey, come on, buddy, we're going to get out of here. We don't like this star. And they leave. Or is it the two stars like, come on, man, what are you doing? We like you. Why are you going away? That star. See, then it becomes, which one's right? In a democracy, 2/3 majority wins. Well, let's say then all of a sudden you create a fourth star above them to empire over them. And you see, if you have two stars, they create a line in relation to one another. If you have three stars, it would create a plane into relation to one another. Now, if you had a fourth star, that establishes a third dimension. But which one's the fourth star? And the whole point of that is that's just your perspective. But it all goes together. You can't have motion without stillness, because you wouldn't know what motion was. So why are we so divided? You wouldn't know what division was unless you knew what unity was. There has to be division because there is also unity. Because we're not always divided. Again, in the idea of church, or in the idea of war, or in the idea of sports, every person on a football team is unique and an individual, and their ego is completely different from the ego of the person next to them. Some people have bigger egos, some people have smaller egos, but they are unified for a common purpose: to win a game. In war, armies are unified for the common purpose of winning the war. So, in that same example, in a football game, there is a division between this team and that team. They are competing against one another for the same goal. Within those teams, there is within those teams, there is unity. And the two teams are divided against one another. But if it were not for that division, you wouldn't have an enjoyable Sunday. Because that's the whole fun of football, is it not? To see which team wins, to see them bash their heads against each other and see that ball fly. And it's that opposition that unites a lot of people in this country. We're obsessed with football. We go crazy over football. We go crazy over basketball, and to some extent baseball. 60 years ago, that was a different story. But even in that division of two teams, it unifies the people that are watching in the same way of war. You had the whole world unified within those divisions. You had many armies within the Axis. You had many armies within the Allies. You had, division of Axis versus Allies. And the people within that unity were brought together. Women in America who had long since before tried to fight for their rights to be equal. Well, they got it in the 20s. But they didn't get a chance to actually show their male counterpart that not only can they do the job just as well, but sometimes better. It unified us. But there's always going to be division. In the 60s, it was, or leading up into the 60s, I should say, it was civil rights. It was the fact that the black man had no rights. He couldn't vote. He wasn't a human being. He was less than human being. And of course, before that it was the woman. And before that it was something else. And after civil rights won and, here we go, we've discovered that, oh no, black people are just the same as white people and just the same as Asian people. We're human beings. Now it's become a fight for gay rights. And there will always be a fight for someone getting rights. Because there always has been. And we've pretty much gotten to the point now in this country where it's becoming okay and accepted. A lot of states have won. And federally, a lot of victories have been achieved for gay rights. And 10, 20 years down the road, it's going to be something else. People are going to start advocating for deer to have rights and this and that. There will always be that opposition. It doesn't matter if I agree or disagree with it. My simple point is that there will always be that. Because we wouldn't know what a unified front was unless we had a divided front. And that's why we're always divided. But it's not a bad thing. Because if you think about it, if we were all one person, if we all had the same ideas and we all thought the same, we all felt the same, we become monotonous, there'd be no life. There would be no spice. That is the way life is. It is that unknown, it's that surprise. You see, we live for that surprise. Because if you knew every step of the journey that you were ever going to take in life, you wouldn't do it. Because the moment that you feel that you know how it's going to end, it's almost as if you've done it and you're not going to do it. No one would ever take their journey in life if they knew how it was going to turn out. Because human beings like the surprise. We loved to be surprised. When someone jumps out behind a door when you're walking by and they scare you, there's a part of you that enjoys that because it reminds you that you're alive. And that is a good thing. We love to be surprised. That's why we're divided. That's why we can't see eye to eye. There can never be world peace. I had a discussion about this the other day. two people were talking about peace, and somebody was talking about how they thought that peace was achievable through X, Y, and Z, and the person says, no, that X, Y, and Z, that's no good. You need peace because of A, B, and C. And I was overhearing them, and they were mutual friends, so I knew of them, they knew of me, and they asked me, well, what do you think about it? And I said, there's no such thing. You can't have world peace. And they said, well, why? I said, because our idea of peace isn't the same. Nobody's idea of peace is the same. And they said, that's preposterous. There's like, we all know what peace is. We all want peace, but we have all this greed and oil and all that. I was like, it has nothing to do with that. And so they said, okay, well, let's hear your explanation. I was like, well, the simple fact of perception. We all do not have the same feelings on peace, and our viewpoint and our perspective and opinion of peace is always going to be different. And I said, but I tell you what, I'll give you this. Let's say that everybody did have the same idea of peace, the exact same idea. Then the question arises, who's going to keep that peace? Well, obviously, it's going to be America. We're going to keep the peace, But then another country says, wait, but why you? Why do you keep the peace? Why does the peace need to be kept? Why don't we keep the peace? And there you go. You can't have peace because we don't see peace the same way. I don't see peace in the same way that you see peace. Because, as I stated earlier, your ego is based off of your experiences and your influences. And that is everything from peace to love to war. Our ideas are different, just simply different. There will never be world peace. But if there was always peace, you wouldn't know what peace was, because you can only have peace if you have war. They go together. And the point is that we don't need to worry about being divided or not divided, because it is a part of it, is a harmonious system. And I believe that. I have faith in that. And so instead of saying, oh no, black might win, so white must win, it is I wouldn't know what black was unless we had white to compare it to. I wouldn't know what white was unless you had black to compare it to. It is that polar thinking that will do more good for you than ever trying to find world peace, because world peace will never happen. Just won't.